Okay, happy Friday, October 11th. Um, so in two, where we are right now is right around module two. So we should be entering into module two. I want to discuss a few things with that today. Before I do, I want to mention that, remind you that in 2 weeks, on October 25th, we will be meeting in V as in Victor for Vet Tech Building, 106. So we'll meet in V 106 at around 11:40. There is a class in there before us. So, there's no need to arrive too much earlier than, 11:35, really. So even 11:40, but I won't get going right at 11:40 just because again there is some action in there before us, and I think they're done at 11:20. So again, you know just kind of hang out if you do arrive early, and at 11:40 we'll just introduce you to the lab, and we'll basically hit the ground running. We'll start with the brain, the sheep brain, and move on to the cow eyeball, and that'll be kind of a twofer section. We'll do those together, not together, but in essence. Um, and then we'll maybe take a little break, and then we'll do the heart, and we may do blood typing as well. I have not you, you're not going to poke each other or check your blood types, but I do have some synthetic blood. We may do some blood typing. I'll talk to Andrew. He's our lab technician and lab coordinator. So if he does have lab kits for blood typing available, we may do that as well. That's a pretty brief activity and pretty straightforward. And then with that, we'll do the heart. Um, and then we'll look at the sheep pluck, which is going to be the heart kind of embedded with the pericardium and then synced up with the diaphragm and the lungs, as well as a trachea. And then there's usually a liver inferior to the diaphragm to go with that. So we'll get to see the lungs. We'll inflate those, and then we'll also, well, you won't. I'll inflate them. You don't have to. That's a messy proposition. But I have a special glass tube that I'll inflate those with. But we don't want any back anything with that for sure. But you do want to see the lungs inflate and even palpate the tissue before and after and during. And then we'll cut into the lungs. We'll dissect them a little bit, and you can see the different tubular structures that are contained therein and the type of tissue. And then we'll get into, should have some GI tracts as well, sheep GI from mouth to anus. So we'll look at those. And then we'll close out with kidneys, and I should have a couple of pregnant rats that we can look at, or at least one. I know I can get at least one, but we may have more than that. So it's always cool to see how many baby rats. I know it sounds weird, but it's for a good cause. It's for your education and your future. But yeah, the rats gave themselves up for us to investigate, and so they have some of them have 6 or 8 little buggers inside. Some of them, and they're varying stages. I've had some we dissect, and they're darn near full term, and there are 14 or 15 of them. You can imagine. And I'll have some where there are almost none in there for sure, or they'll be very tiny, like maybe the size of a Tic Tac, and they'll be, you guys know what a Tic Tac is, I hope. Well, I don't know, but I hope. Maybe it's best you don't. They're probably full of bad chemicals, but you've at least seen them on the aisle at the grocery store, the checkout lane. But anyway, the size of Tic Tacs, and there might be only like 4 or 5 or 8 of them or something like that. So But anyway, it'll be fun to see and exciting, and then certainly very interesting to see what's there. And then I usually have a couple male rats as well. So we'll finish out with reproductive. So that whole process on the 25th will probably go past 1/4. Just talking about it because I'm out of breath. So, so do so doing it is going to be, you know. It'll probably go more than 2 hours. I can tell you that. But you're certainly welcome to, if you need to leave early, that's fine. But it won't go a lot past 1:40. It'll probably go, I think we could probably be done by 2 o'clock. But anyway, um, so in lab safety, all of you have done that, so I won't have to spend much time going back over that. I will introduce you to the dissection tools. So you're really only going to use the scalpel, the scissors with the blunt end, because you may use the pointy ones occasionally to cut some tissue that's away from the organ. But if you're cutting near the organ, we definitely want to use the blunt scissors for that. And then you'll have a blunt probe as well. But other than that, you probably won't use very many of the tools. And then I supply you with gloves and anything else PPE wise that you might need. Let's see. So we left off. So anyway, if you have questions about that, it's a very loose atmosphere. You'll be able to, you can, you'll, um, I think you'll at the very least work in pairs. Now, you may work in groups of three. It's really up to you how you end up working together. But usually it just comes by happenstance. Some of you may know each other. You may not know you know each other until you're there, and then you're like, oh yeah, I know you from some other course. But anyway, I don't think I have 20. I think they're going to be close to 20 of you there. No, I think it's 16. Anyway, they'll be between 15 and 20. So, I don't know if I might have 15 brains, I might have 15 eyeballs, but I might even have 15 hearts, but I don't know. I definitely don't have 15 of anything else, maybe kidneys. But anyway, the GI tract and the pluck, those will be more or less demos. So I usually only have one or two specimens, maybe three at the most of those. But I usually have quite a few hearts, and so I'll talk to Andrew if I get a number. But usually students work in either pairs or trios or quads. So so anyway, just keep that in mind as well. Um, so that'll be exciting. I look forward to that. It'll be in 2 weeks. So anyhow, and if you have questions, just email me about that. If you can't, if you said yes, you were going to come in the poll, but you wake up that morning and something came up, you got called into work, or anything could have come up, or maybe you just feel you don't feel like going. Maybe you're like, I'm good. That's fine too. You don't have to. You don't have to email me if you don't want to. It's not a big deal. Like I say, it's more or less kind of, I view it as more or less like an open lab. So it's not necessarily like there's, I mean, I may take attendance. See, now that sounds weird and that puts pressure on people. Anyway, it doesn't really, attendance is not a big deal. It's awesome if you can be there. It's awesome if you can't be there. So either way, it's awesome. So don't worry about anything. Um, and let's see. Well, other than that, I don't think there's anything else with the dissection. Nope. Okay, so let's move on. Module one, you hopefully have finished that. Not hopefully. That's see now that even sounds kind of like there's expectation on you, and if you didn't meet it, then you're disappointing me in some way, and that's not true either. So, many of you have finished module one. I have seen in the grade book, and so that's good. If you haven't finished module one, then that's fine too. Just keep plugging away, and you once you finish, you'll know that you've finished through. You started your first three body systems. So you did integumentary in Unit 2, and then you got into bones and muscles in Unit 3. So briefly, in case you haven't made it, been giving you vertigo doing that back and forth, so I'll stop. But I want to stop. I do want to stop here for a second. Bones and muscles. There are a couple of items that I do want to mention before we get into Module 2 today. With bones and muscles, I think there are certainly a few chemistry items that I want to mention, and those relate to something that you are well aware of before you ever took this course, and that's the relationship that bones have with calcium. So we know that calcium, quote unquote, builds strong bones, and the primary composition of bone is going to be calcium. And so um, now it's a calcium storage facility more than anything, the skeletal system. And we also see another chemical, phosphorus, and different phosphates are going to be, in bone as well. But our focus is going to be on calcium for us for a few minutes. When we talk about bones and they're storing calcium, the reason that they are storing that calcium is so they can provide muscle, primarily cardiac and skeletal muscle, but really all muscle needs calcium to contract. Now, again, we want to think of the contractile properties of skeletal and cardiac. And when we go back to the cellular aspect of really any tissue, is an organelle that we looked at called the endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER, and we saw a smooth endoplasmic reticulum and a rough endoplasmic reticulum, and we know the rough ER is primarily going to be dealing with ribosomes and protein synthesis. Now, when we look at cells of the muscle, we call those fibers. So when you hear the word muscle fiber, it's really a fancy way of saying a muscle cell. And so a muscle fiber, and remember, cells are uh, from one tissue to one organ to another, they're specialized. So we're going to see different structural features with cells from different organs. So muscles, especially cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle cells, which again are called muscle fibers. So I'm sure you've heard that before, the word fibers, muscle fibers, and I'm sure you've heard the word cells before. I know that for a fact. But when we're talking about the specialized cells of muscle tissue, they're called muscle fibers. So the smooth endoplasmic reticulum of muscle fibers is actually going to be called a sarcoplasmic reticulum. So smooth endoplasmic reticulum of muscle cells or muscle fibers, again, is going to be called sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it's almost like it's almost like we put smooth endoplasmic together. Well, it may be, but any sarco means flesh. So you're going to see sarcomere, sarcolemma, sarcoplasmic. So you may have noticed that if you've made it through the muscles, that kind of root, or if you're taking med term, that root for flesh or for muscle is sarc, and combining form sarco, SARCO. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is a series of folded tubes that are inside of a muscle fiber and around a muscle fiber within the components of the cytoplasm. So, or what we would call sarcoplasm. Okay, so again, you see the theme there. The specialized muscle cells or fibers are going to have terminology with them that has the combining form sarco in there. So anyway, sarcoplasm, sarcoplasmic reticulum. So inside of that sarcoplasmic reticulum is where we're going to find calcium stored. So the calcium that's stored inside that sarcoplasmic reticulum needs to be replenished from time to time and needs to have we need to have a constant supply of calcium there. Every time the heart beats and every time a muscle contracts, calcium gets released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and enables the filaments at the deeper level they're just basically microfilaments, again, going back to cell structures, microfilaments of muscles we call myofilaments, and they're actin and myosin. And in order to get actin and myosin to bind together, we need calcium to expose those binding sites. So once we expose those binding sites, we're going to get the myosin heads to connect to the actin and then we're going to get some movement. And once we no longer need a contraction, so between contractions of muscle, we have a brief period of relaxation. And at that point, we're going to see calcium leave and go back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. At that spot, we're going to see uh, pumps because we're going to have calcium already in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So we're going to have to employ calcium pumps to put the calcium back against its concentration gradient into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So, and remember on cellular transport mechanism talk, we always know if we say pump or see pump, that means we need energy, and cellular energy is in the form of ATP. So you need ATP to work the calcium pumps associated with the sarcoplasmic reticulum to get calcium pumped back in to that spot to encourage relaxation of the muscle. And remember, to get ATP optimally, you need glucose and oxygen. So for muscles to function properly, we need the pumps to pump. So we need ATP, therefore we need glucose and oxygen as well. So calcium is important, and that's where our focus is at the moment. And again, we get a lot of so we need this going on all the time, right? With the heart muscles beating constantly. And so to encourage that, we do need to have a constant supply of calcium. And the bones, the skeletal system does provide that for the animal. Now, in humans, we do have a condition called osteoporosis, where the bones do become more porous. We are lacking calcium potentially, or at least not having the optimal amount of calcium. So anyway, that's where clinically you might see something like that. Now, let's see. Another chemical or another ion or mineral that's involved in muscle contraction certainly is going to be magnesium. So magnesium comes into play as well when we're getting ATP and then breaking up breaking up ATP into ADP and P, so we can then recycle it back during that contraction phase. Because ironically, to get a muscle to contract, ATP is kind of hanging out. It's kind of at rest because remember, you need ATP to close the binding sites, and then we need ATP to pump the calcium back in to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So again, you think of needing energy for muscles to work. Your brain thinks, okay, for muscles to contract, but in reality, yeah, it's that recycle phase, that relaxation, kind of reset everything phase. That's where the ATP need really hits its peak. So that's where glucose and oxygen really come into play. Magnesium and calcium are working agents as well in all of that. So I wanted to mention that because oftentimes those ideas and those concepts, when you're reading through them or you're listening or watching the videos for those, you're looking through your outlines. A lot of times the chemistry stuff gets glossed over, so I totally understand that. I I was you once as well, and chemistry, although very interesting when I was a student, it was also very hard to conceptualize. So So anyway, which meant oftentimes that I would skip over it or gloss over it and focus more on what I could conceptualize, which was usually the anatomy. So the physical anatomy, we're at the point where macro or gross anatomy is something that, again, we're going to see in the lab, but it's also something that you can conceptualize a lot easier. So when you do look at the skeletal system of different animals, and you look at the muscular system of different animals, oftentimes, these structural features and are going to be named for, where they're located. And again, as you're working in the clinic, there are over 600 muscles, in most mammals. And so some have fewer, some have more, same with other reptiles, amphibians, birds. But for the most part, there are a lot of muscles, is my point. Very tiny ones and very large ones. And so, with all kinds of different shapes that promote different types of movements. And so, again, those muscles are going to be named for their action. They're going to be named for how many origin heads they have. They're going to be named for their shape. So there are a variety of different naming systems or nomenclatures associated with skeletal muscle, particularly. So I think in the clinical setting, you're certainly not going to be dealing with all of these different muscles. You're going to be dealing with musculature more or less in maybe injection sites for intramuscular shots. Certainly when you're dealing with syringes, you're going to be giving shots that are going to be just transdermal. They're just going to go across the skin. You're going to be giving shots that are actually going to go into musculature. Oftentimes, we use the deltoid or the gluteus region. That's the thickest musculature, usually of most animals. So again, oftentimes, clinically speaking, you're probably, unless you get into like equine massage or, which is, or physical therapy, then you would definitely become more specialized, and at that point you would be learning more specific muscles. So hopefully that, so my my point is I don't want you stressing out too terribly much over the nomenclature and specifics of muscles. Now, that doesn't mean, getting some exposure to the specifics isn't going to hurt a little bit. And certainly that's not my intention is to hurt. But I do want you to stretch your brains a little bit and at least have some exposure uh, to, some of these more specific clinical muscles. So anyway, same with the bones. There are a few hundred bones that we can potentially deal with, but in the long run, you're clinically speaking, you may only deal with, maybe 10 or 20 bones at any, that are regulars. And even that's probably a stretch, so anyway, as you go through your program and as you work in the real world setting, you'll notice patterns. You'll be exposed to common themes when it comes to anatomy. You'll also be exposed to common themes when it comes to the physiology. And that's where the pharmacology comes into play as well. So as we go through this course, a lot of the information that you're receiving is going to ultimately be utilized when you get more into your pharmacological and pathological studies. So as you get to studying diseases or studying, well, you may do them at the same time. I'm not sure. That's ideal, probably, but to study diseases and the pharmacology or how we oftentimes the drug treatment for those diseases. Um, so anyway, as you go through this course and as you're studying and being exposed to these different body systems, I think it's important, and you're doing this in med term as well. You're really going to transition this knowledge over to the disease aspect. So we're telling you what normal anatomy and physiology should look like with the basics, and then you'll get into What happens when it doesn't look like these? What happens when the anatomy is off? Then we know the physiology is going to be off, and vice versa. We could have physiological issues from lack of a vitamin, mineral, carb, protein, fat, water, dehydration issues that's affecting physiology, stressors that affect physiology that then lead to physical issues, maybe micro physical issues on the cellular level or higher level physical issues such as muscle aches, muscle pains, constipation, heart palpitations, kidney stones, etc. So when we get into heart valve dysfunction, so when we start looking at physical ailments, physical maladies, physical pathologies, we are definitely thinking about anatomy. And again, we want to consider the physiological or the chemical aspects of why that anatomy is the way it is. Because again, when on the clinical level, when we're running tests, we're really looking at different signs. We're looking at the vital signs are something measurable, and we're really measuring some physiology as well as some anatomy. So we're trying to get that kind of blend to look at what physically is in the urine, what physically may be in this blood sample. What does the meaning of a heart rate that's hyper or hypo, what does that mean potentially physically and chemically? So so anyway, that's why you're doing this, and then the pharmacology is oftentimes the physiology that is maybe missing, so or is in excess. Pardon me. So we may see instances with disease or disorder where we have excess something or deficient something, and that's what's creating the physical abnormality. So anyway, so that's the chemistry basic lesson for bone and muscle. The other thing I want to mention with bone too, before I talk a few minutes about uh, the next unit, the next module, bone we know also is the site of blood cell production. So we're going to see red blood cell, white blood cell, platelets, all coming from bone marrow. So um, and again, red blood cells are replaced about every 120 days or so. Not all at once, obviously, but the lifespan of a red blood cell is relatively short. So the bone marrow is constantly producing red blood cells, and red blood cells you want to remember. Well, we haven't made it there yet, so you're not going to remember anything. I'm getting the cart before the horse, but that's a teaser trailer for later that red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets will discuss at the end of this module. So this week I want to talk a little bit about nervous, maybe a little bit about endocrine, and then next week I want to discuss more with endocrine, and then get into blood and lymph and immunity. So that will lead us into um, uh, our meeting on the 25th. So today's the 11th. We'll discuss a little bit with nerves and the nervous system, a little bit with the endocrine system and senses, and then we'll continue that next week and then get into blood a little bit. So that if we are able to do some blood typing as well, we'll have a little bit better idea what's going on. But I do want to mention that the skeletal system is a big player in blood production, blood cell production. So let's see, nervous system. A couple of items that I want to note as you go through the nervous system. It is comprised of the brain and spinal cord as the central aspect, and then the peripheral aspect is going to be comprised of the nerves. So, um, when you're looking at the nervous system, you're going to notice a pattern of organization that really kind of distinguishes itself as being central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system. And again, when we look at the central, which is brain and spinal cord, we'll look at some of the key features structurally of both of those items in a couple of weeks. So really between now and the 25th, it'll be a good idea for you to have taken at least a little bit of a look. Hopefully you'll be past this section, but maybe not. But you want to look at some of the basic anatomy of the nervous system, specifically the brain. So that's where most of the anatomy is. The spinal cord and nerves have very, very basic anatomy. So there aren't a lot of structural aspects of the spinal cord and nerves. So they're just a couple of layers of lipid and protein type material, um, and then a whole bunch of neurons packed together. But when we look at the brain, it's a little more complicated anatomically. So please look at that between now and 2 weeks from now. Um, I will refresh your memories or introduce you to it. Either way, you're going to be exposed to the sheep brain, and a lot of the mammalian brain anatomy features are going to be similar from species to species. So sheep brains are more inexpensive than, and I mean they're about the size of your fist. So they're not super big, so they're easy to manage. So anyway, so we'll look at some brain anatomy. Now, brain physiology, we're thinking of a special term called neurotransmitters. The chemistry in the brain you'll run across is going to relate, and the whole nervous system is going to relate to neurotransmitters. Now, you may have been introduced, or if you made it through muscles, you'll have been introduced to neurotransmitters there. In one of those so we have another chemical in the body. We have a couple of different chemicals. We have groups or classifications of chemicals. We have what are called enzymes. So one type of chemical in the body group is called the enzymes group. Enzymes are typically protein based or amino acid based, and they're going to be there for speeding up chemical reactions, making metabolism on the cellular level and on the macro level go a little bit faster. You would think maybe of like saliva is a type of enzyme or has an enzyme in it called amylase. Your digestive tract has several different enzymes that speed up the process of breaking down nutrients. And then again, on the cellular level, we'll see enzymes to continue the process of metabolism. So oh, chemicals in the body. So, and then we have hormones are another classification of chemicals. So we'll see those when we get to the endocrine system. And then lastly, one of the major classifications of chemicals in the body are going to relate to the nervous system, and they're called neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are simply chemicals in either the brain, spinal cord, or peripheral nervous system. We oftentimes will find neurotransmitters located at the junction between nerves and muscles. So, when you did muscle studies last week, you may have come across acetylcholine or ACH as the abbreviation. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that's found at the neuromuscular junction. So, basically, where the nerve meets and plugs into the muscle, you're going to find chemicals in the bell knob or that synaptic knob or that terminal of the axon of the neuron or of the nerve. So the axon of the neuron of the nerve of the peripheral nervous system. So, so anyway, we find neurotransmitters oftentimes located at where we call the synapse. So where a neuron meets another neuron, or where a neuron meets some other cell, so in the nervous system and the muscle system uh, combined, we'd have the nerve fiber meeting up with the muscle fiber. So the nerve cell and the muscle cell coming together. Now, throughout the nervous system, especially in the central nervous system and especially in the brain, we're going to have densely compacted neurons coming into contact with one another. And you'll see on the microanatomy that the axons are going to connect with the dendrites. And all neurons have one single axon and typically multiple dendrites. So the transmission of information and energy and electricity and chemistry is all going to travel away from the cell body of the neuron, and it's going to go to the next cell body of a neighboring neuron via the axon. So the axon always is away. All right. So nerves, neurotransmission always goes away from the cell body or the nucleus of the neuron via that axon. So axon always away. And then at the axon terminal, which means the end of the axon, you're going to find little knobs or bells that are going to have chemicals inside of them called neurotransmitters. So that's something you're going to run across, neurotransmitters, and dopamine and serotonin are a couple of common um, endorphins or group that you'll see, and enkephalins. So you'll read and see different neurotransmitters in the brain on the chemical level. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to mention briefly with the nervous system is this is the classification part. When we look at the peripheral nervous system, we're going to see the nerves are going to be divided into motor nerves versus sensory nerves. So we know that the motor pathway is delivering messages away from the central nervous system. So the motor pathway is going to be what we call the effector or the efferent pathway with an E. So the motor pathway is the delivery response system of the central and peripheral, well, primarily the peripheral nervous system. So when the central nervous system provides a response signal, it's going to travel down the motor pathway. And the motor nerve pathways are going to end at a variety of different glands or muscles. So again, if I touch something hot and then I move my arm away from that hot item, the motor response is coming from my spinal cord or my brain and traveling down a motor nerve pathway. So then the other pathway is called the sensory pathway. They call that the afferent pathway as well. So the afferent pathway or sensory pathway is when we are delivering sensory information to the central nervous system. So again, when we look at the PNS or the peripheral nervous system, we're going to see a motor and a sensory pathway. We also have a special sensory pathway that'll relate to those special senses that are above the neck. Um, so with that being said, you're also going to run across when we talk about the PNS or the peripheral nervous system, you're going to run across what they call the sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways of the autonomic nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is going to be divided into something called somatic, which is going to be voluntary behavior, versus autonomic, which is going to be automatic behaviors or responses. So somatic, voluntary, autonomic, involuntary. So when I am talking and I'm picking up my pen and I'm writing things down, or I'm driving down the street, rolling down my window and getting out of my car, and I'm doing all of these physical movements, those are part of the somatic nervous system. So that's it's a similar set of nervous system mechanics that we see with any motor response, but the somatic motor response is more voluntary skeletal muscle movement, whereas the autonomic response system or the autonomic nervous system that deals more with smooth and cardiac muscle response mechanisms. So these are going to be more involuntary. And when we think about smooth muscle, we know cardiac is heart, but when we think about smooth muscle, we want to always consider your cardiovascular system beyond the cardio part, but also the vascular. The vascular is your vein, artery, capillary network that is going to be containing and composed of smooth muscle. Your entire digestive tract is smooth muscle. Respiratory tract is smooth muscle. Urinary tract is smooth muscle. So all these tracts are smooth muscle. And so the autonomic nerve, so we don't have to think about the heart beating. We don't have to think about food digestion. We don't have to think about urinary formation or urine formation in the urinary system. We don't need to think about sperms. Males don't have to think about sperm cell production. Females don't have to think about oogenesis or the eggs being released, although that can be very physical and very thought and emotional, certainly, right? But for the most part, we're not really telling it what to do. It just does it, right? We're not thinking about breathing, even. It's just happening. So there are so many physical and physiological processes that are occurring that are completely automatic. And so that still occurs because of the peripheral nervous system. It still occurs because of the presence of nerves. So these nerve pathways are different than the somatic pathways that are voluntary. These autonomic pathways are going to be automatic, and they're going to be separated up or divided up into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So when we talk about we'll talk about parasympathetic real quick first. Parasympathetic is simply our normal homeostatic physiology going on. So when your heart is beating at 60 to 80 beats a minute, when your internal body temperature is staying right at 98.6 or right, roughly, when your blood pressure is 120 over 80, when you're producing urine at the right volume, per minute, when you're producing, assimilating nutrients at the right volume per minute, when all of these things are going on, they need nerve, but they need stimulus response pathways. But when they're all happening in this normal rate, we call that the parasympathetic pathway. We call it the rest and digest pathway. So parasympathetic in essence is homeostasis. That's your normalcy. Now, when there's some sort of trigger or stimulus, when there's a trigger or a stimulus that puts the heart rate, elevates the heart rate, elevates the blood pressure, elevates the rate of respiration, elevates internal body temp. All of these things start changing because of a stimulus. That's called the sympathetic nervous system. This is consciously speaking, this becomes the fight or flight pathway. So and now freeze, we hear that another F word in there, fight, flight, or freeze. So depending on the trigger, and also depending on the individual that's being triggered, the response may be something of a stress response, which is going to be we need to engage our arms, legs, and head in a fight or run, typically. And again, it could be freeze. If that's the case, my heart rate and blood pressure and respiration rate all go up because my arm and leg muscles need a lot more oxygen going to them as well as glucose. So digestion will usually shut down during a sympathetic response and everything else increases. Pupils will dilate. So anyhow, that's some of the basic chemistry that you'll run across with the nervous system. Sympathetic. So know the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic. The primary chemical for a sympathetic response in the sympathetic nervous system is going to be adrenaline or epinephrine. The primary chemical for the parasympathetic response is going to be acetylcholine, ACH, which you saw with muscle contraction. So remember then, once the stimulus is no longer triggering, maybe the stimulus is gone, maybe the brain, you know, organized itself and began to cope with the trigger. So it's no longer a trigger. Any variety of workings go on with the individual when it comes to perception of stressors and subsequent coping of stressors. In humans, we look at something called adversity intelligence. So how a human, animals have it too. We just maybe don't, collect data as much on it, but we've we've started to collect data on human response to adversity. And so, we talk about emotional intelligence and social intelligence and certainly intelligence quotients like mental intelligence. But one of the newer forms of intelligence that we're starting to get into on the sociology and psychology level is adversity intelligence. And how well does one handle a perceived trigger or a perceived stressor? How do you respond to stress? And in America and maybe worldwide, but I know firsthand knowledge in America, we generally see stress as a commodity. So we like having people stressed out, and we like being able to provide them with coping mechanisms that mask healthy response patterns, such as, maybe smoking or maybe caffeine consumption or maybe pill popping of different types or whatever it might be. Maybe it's just consuming in general. Maybe it's gambling. Maybe it's having a social media addiction. But anyhow, addictions come from in all forms, and their physical responses to perceived stressors typically, and then they become routines beyond just patterns of behavior become routine, and they can be devastating to someone's life. We see it in pets. You guys, I'm talking about this in part for your own benefit, your own awareness, but also, when you get into the clinical setting, you're going to be dealing with a lot of animals that are coming in that have issues that maybe are in part because of the anxiety that they're expressing, physical response to perceived or real triggers that are causing them anxiety. So, so anyway, it's a real thing, and how an animal responds to triggers and stressors uh, can relate again to their level of adversity intelligence. So, with dogs, we certainly want to get them the proper exercise and activity and the proper nutrients and things like that. So anyway, just want to mention those items as well. Let's see. So that's the name of the game with with the nervous system. There's a lot to take in with the nervous system. It's a pretty hefty outline and a pretty hefty chapter. But generally speaking, the basics of the anatomy and the come down to a lot of different organizational levels and kind of branches of organization that all really kind of lead to parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, of the autonomic nervous system, of the peripheral nervous system, which then still, all roads ultimately go to and away from the brain and spinal cord, or again, what we call the central nervous system. Okay, so and then this gets into sense organs a little bit. So we'll dissect specific. Well, we're going to see with the nose when we dissect the brain, we're going to see the olfactory bulbs and the olfactory nerves that are associated with the sense of smell. So you'll notice that term, olfactory. By the way, when we look at the brain and we look at the peripheral nervous system of the brain, we call those the specialized peripheral nervous system of the brain, the cranial nerves. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So you'll come across cranial nerves. Again, whenever you hear or see the word nerve, it simply has to do with the peripheral nervous system. So the nerves that come off the brain are called cranial nerves. The nerves that come off the spinal cord are called spinal nerves. So, and again, they're going to have motor pathways and sensory pathways, spinal nerves will. Many of your cranial nerves are going to have uh, sensory motor pathways, but they might also have special sensory pathways, which leads you to the sense of smell, which we just talked about, the sense of sight, which you'll see the optic nerve relating to. You'll see a lot of cranial nerves actually relate to the movements of the actual eyeball. So, not necessarily the special sense of vision, but the ability to motor or move the eyeball. We also have sound and balance, cranial nerves, vestibulocochlear, you'll see that term. The vestibule has to do with balance, and the cochlea has to do with sound. So we'll have some special sensory nerves that relate to that as well. And then certainly the sense of taste. We'll have some glosso and tongue cranial nerves. Then there are several cranial nerves that have to do with facial expressions, with swallowing, with speech. So again, if you do have an animal, or you yourself, or someone, a human that you know, is having issues with swallowing, with speech, with proprioception of the face. So, if they have like a droopy, saggy face, or an animal has a droopy, saggy ear, that could be an indicator of cranial nerve damage or brain damage. So you want to keep that in mind as well. Endocrine system, that's going to relate to the nervous system. These are the specialized glands that are going to produce hormones that dump directly into the bloodstream. So you're going to be viewing probably a good 6 or 8 specialized endocrine organs. We typically start in the brain. We're going to actually see a couple of these. We'll see the pineal gland when we dissect the brain, and the pineal is related to melatonin levels, or the circadian rhythm of the animal. So we'll see that. We'll also see the pituitary and the hypothalamus. The pituitary is the master gland. We'll see perhaps no fewer than probably 6 or 8 hormones produced by the pituitary. And we do break it up into front and back. So there is an anterior pituitary that produces several hormones related to metabolism and growth, and certainly a lot of trigger hormones or stimulating hormones are going to come from the anterior pituitary. So we're going to see that it basically dictates the release of hormones from other endocrine glands in the body. So For instance, like the thyroid gland will only release thyroid hormone when the pituitary releases a specialized hormone to tell it to. So the pituitary is kind of the boss of all other glands in the body. The hypothalamus, which isn't technically a gland, it's like a nervous system, it's like a brain region filled with specialized neurons that produce specialized neurotransmitters as well as hormones. So we'll see the hypothalamus does produce so it's a region in the brain that's linked with the pituitary that produces some releasing hormones. So basically, you'll see the hypothalamus tells the pituitary what to do. And then, because every boss has a boss. So just when you think the pituitary is the master endocrine gland, well, we have to back it up a second and think, well, what about the hypothalamus and its role in all of this? Well, the hypothalamus role in all of this is certainly to tell the pituitary what to do. So the hypothalamus is really kind of the CEO or the owner of the whole operation, and then the pituitary is maybe more like the manager, the store manager. So anyhow, the pituitary you'll see does release a lot of hormones that tell other glands to release their hormones. And then the posterior pituitary is going to relate to some of the pregnancy hormones, childbirth hormones, lactating hormones. Um, let's see other glands and hormones. As we work down, we get into the throat area and we see that's where we're going to find the thyroid gland. And then that's going to have a lot of your basic metabolism hormones. So when we do have metabolic issues in the body, um, so we have an excessively overweight critter or an excessively gaunt, frail, thin critter. We could have some sort of a thyroid issue with the little bugger. So we may run some blood tests to check thyroid hormone levels. And you never know. It may be, your pet's obesity issue or uh, frail, gaunt, thin issue could relate to them just lacking some medication for their thyroid. Um, but remember, the thyroid's controlled by the pituitary, which is controlled by the hypothalamus. So there could be an issue all the way up in the brain that's causing a problem with the thyroid. Let's see. So thyroid. Oh, we also with the thyroid we see calcium homeostasis. A couple of the big dog homeostatic chemical processes that we see are certainly glucose homeostasis because we want to make sure that glucose levels are constantly where they need to be, right? Because cells, mitochondria specifically, use glucose for energy. So blood glucose and glucose homeostasis is important. But remember, we started this whole conversation today or discussion today with talking about calcium and the importance of calcium with regard to bone structure, but also with regard to muscle function. So calcium homeostasis is extremely important. And the thyroid gland, along with the parathyroid glands, which are four tiny, I don't know, maybe the size of M&Ms or mini M&Ms, Skittles. It's Halloween time. We gotta talk candy, right? But anyway, the parathyroids are small, um, you know, circular glands that sit in the posterior, kind of behind the thyroid, called parathyroid glands. So you'll read and see about those parathyroid hormone and then thyroid and its hormones. T3 and T4, thyroxine and triiodothyronine are a couple that you'll see. But also you'll run across calcitonin from the thyroid gland. And then the parathyroid produces parathyroid hormone. So that's kind of nice. They just give it a regular name. So calcitonin from the thyroid and parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland, those two are antagonists of one another. In other words, they work against each other, not in a bad way, in a healthy way. They maintain help us to maintain calcium homeostasis. So calcitonin kind of has the word calci in it from calcium. So it tones up your calcium. Um, so anyhow, let's see, another gland around the heart, we have the thymus gland, and the thymus gland is where we see T cells. So that we oftentimes relate the thymus gland with immunity and immune function. So T cells with the thymus gland. That's where, remember, I said earlier that the skeletal system is where we often find blood cells, including white blood cells, being born. Lymphocytes are born in bone marrow. They're called B cell lymphocytes. Some of them are going to travel over to the thymus gland, which is again right around the heart, and they're going to mature in the thymus gland, and they become what are called T cell lymphocytes. So if the T cell lymphocyte count is low, we could have some immune system issues for sure, immunocompromised or immunosuppressed. Um, so anyway, the thing about the thymus is that it does decrease in size over time. So in the earlier stages of growth and development out after birth, so outside of the womb, we do see the thymus gland at its most active and most relevant. As we age and get into the elderly era, we see the thymus gland almost become non-existent. So, unfortunately, our immune systems are way more compromised the older we get, in part because the thymus gland isn't really there. So let's see. Let's keep moving. As you can tell, we're going from superior to inferior down the midline of the body when we're talking about the hormones and the endocrine system. So we travel further south or more inferior, and we start to see the pancreas. And the pancreas is the only organ of the body that's both endocrine and exocrine. We see the pancreas producing a lot of enzymes that are for digestion. So those are the exocrine aspects. We won't talk about those now. We'll save those for a couple of weeks, 3, 4 weeks from now, when we get to the digestive system. And then, so anyhow, pancreas as an endocrine gland is going to produce two hormones. Because remember, if it's endocrine, it's producing hormones, and they're going to be called insulin and glucagon. Those two hormones are going to relate to glucose homeostasis. So again, when we see calcium homeostasis, we're thinking of the thyroid and parathyroid. When we talk about glucose homeostasis, we're thinking of the pancreas and insulin and glucagon. So when blood sugar levels are high, we release insulin to attach to glucose and pull the glucose out of the bloodstream. When blood glucose levels are low, the pancreas will release glucagon, which will travel to the liver and basically awaken stored glucose, which is called glycogen. And so this stored glucose or glycogen will get converted into usable glucose by the presence of glucagon, which is coming from the pancreas. And then at that point, our blood sugar levels are high again. And so we need insulin to pull the blood or pull the the glucose out of the bloodstream. So anyway, the pancreas as an endocrine gland is doing a whole heck of a lot of stuff of teeter-tottering to balance glucose. So glucagon when blood sugar is low, insulin when glucose is in the blood or when blood glucose is higher. We continue to travel around there. We have the adrenal glands that sit atop the kidneys. Those are endocrine glands as well. They're going to produce several different hormones that relate to water balance. One of the main jobs of the kidneys is to maintain fluid and electrolyte balance. So, sodium and potassium are major electrolytes. And then, of course, water. So, water, sodium, potassium balance are helped to happen, are enabled, encouraged by the presence of hormones, aldosterone, for instance, that's going to come from the adrenal glands. So, we do see the adrenals produce adrenaline, epinephrine, adrenal corticotropic hormone, which is ACTH, which again will help with fluid balance. But we also so that'll involve the skin because the skin helps with fluid balance as well through sweating. So anyway, um, the adrenals, another endocrine gland. The kidneys produce hormone as well. They produce erythropoietin for one, which is a red blood cell hormone. It basically when oxygen levels maybe are lower than we want them to be, maybe because of stress. Because remember, when the body perceives stress, it goes into that adrenergic, sympathetic mode, and so more oxygen is needed for the cells, for the mitochondria, and so because more oxygen is needed, more red blood cells, which carry oxygen, are going to be needed. And so the kidneys kind of regulate pH a little bit. They regulate the balance of along with the respiratory system. We're regulating pH. We're regulating oxygen, hydrogen levels. So anyway, um, if we're under stress chronically, even acutely, if it's intense, the kidneys might tell the bones to produce more red blood cells because then we're bringing in more oxygen, and we need more red blood cells to carry that increase in oxygen. So anyway, the kidneys are also technically, I would say, an endocrine organ because they do produce hormone. And then lastly are the male and female reproductive glands. So the ovaries and testes are also endocrine glands. And we'll look at those in way more detail at the end of basically the body system stuff. So I think at the end of module 3, we get into reproduction. We'll talk about meiosis a little bit as well. So we'll look at the real micro scale of that. So endocrine. Endocrine is again, this is that goes back to basically day one of positive and negative feedback and homeostasis. So again, the critter, including us as critters, are constantly trying to maintain, we are all trying to maintain some level or range of balance and integrity within the body. And so the nervous system and the endocrine system are working together to, in essence, maintain that balance. And so when there are external factors that come into play, they could be stressors, life stressors, certainly, but they could also be physical stressors, such as, certain consumables that you've been exposed to, or lack of consumables. We see in the clinical setting, there's oftentimes a lot of malnourishment. Malnourishment doesn't come in the form of like looking like anorexia or something. That's just a form of malnourishment. Obesity is a form of malnourishment. Malnourishment just means poor nutrition. So we do see a lot of malnourishment. And so again, that's altering the hormone levels. It's altering the structural integrity of the hormones. Because remember, hormones are used up and then they're done. Whereas neurotransmitters, they get used and they get uptaken. So when a neurotransmitter is dumped into an area, the once we're done, basically the neurotransmitter just gets sent to kind of the surface of the neighboring cell. Then it triggers other cellular processes, and then the neurotransmitter goes back to where it came from once the process is over. Whereas hormones, they get dumped into so neurotransmitters are instant reaction, instant response, and they're recycled. Whereas endocrine system and hormones, they have target cells, which again are usually glandular or muscular. So and they travel a distance in the bloodstream. I mean, a hormone could travel from the brain all the way down to the ovaries or testes to get a response, or from the brain all the way down to the adrenal glands or the kidneys just to get a response. So that's a long way to go compared to a neurotransmitter. So hormones travel long distances and they're not recycled. So the hormones get used and then you're done. So the endocrine gland has to constantly be producing its hormone. And the ingredients to produce the hormone come from your diet. And many hormones are protein and amino acid and nitrogen based, and a handful, five or so hormones, the sex hormones particularly, are steroid based or fat or lipid based. So if you're not getting the proper lipids and the proper proteins, then you may not be getting the proper ingredients to make the proper hormones that you need or that the animal needs. So the endocrine system and the nervous system are extremely important. And again, we talked a little bit about adversity intelligence and stress perception and stress response and all of that. That's also chronic stress as breaking down our bodies and our body systems and our organs and our tissues and our cells. So all of the pathologies we see not all, many of the pathologies that we see nowadays can be related certainly to stress and how the body's response to stress, how the body's exposure to stress, how the body perceives stress. I mean, all of these relate then to coping mechanisms and how the body responds to all of these triggers. And if you don't have the right tools and ingredients to be able to reply and respond to those constant perceived stress triggers, then it's going to wear down the body systems, and really alters the pH balance, and yeah, it can put us in a state of some real dis-ease or disease. Um, so that no amount of pharmacology is going to help. So sometimes it comes down to mind change to get physical change to happen. So anyhow, that's all I'm going to talk about today. Next week, I want to. So we're done with Endocrine. We got a lot further than I thought. I want to introduce you to some stuff that you're going to read about and that you're going to watch in those videos that I have, and that you're going to be quizzed on. Um, the other thing here, so next week we'll get into blood and lymph, and then we may be able to start in and look at the heart a little bit as well, which is going to be Unit 7. And then that'll lead us right to our dissection day. So I think that's going to be my goal next week is to kind of zip through blood, lymph, and immunity so we can then talk a little bit about the heart and maybe even the lungs and some of the stuff that we're going to be dissecting. And then once we're done with the dissection, let me look at my calendar again real quick. And then after dissection day, three, four, we're only going to have four more meetings. So in Zoom. So we'll meet next week in Zoom, and I appreciate you guys being here. I know it's not required certainly for you to be here. I appreciate that you are here. There are about 21 of you, and it looks like today it's it's been up to, I think I saw 8 or 9 were in here at one point, and right now there are 6 of you. So I appreciate that. And those who aren't in here, if you're watching the video, that's awesome too. Hopefully, everything that we discuss and that I go through is helpful and beneficial, and that you're able to add that into your toolbox for how you're attaining information. Um, because again, you know as well as I do nowadays, there are so many ways to attain info. So I'm definitely not the fountain of all knowledge. I do have quite a bit of knowledge, and I certainly enjoy sharing it with you guys. And but I also am humble and enough to know that there are way maybe more appealing or interesting ways of approaching some of what we discuss. And so I also try to encourage you to search those out while also providing you with a little bit of another perspective of all of this stuff. So anyway, you guys have a great weekend. I'm going to stop recording.